Thanks. Thanks, Carly. So today I wanted to just spend 15 minutes talking about the rollout of our hospital-wide sepsis program at RMH, and really to draw together why sepsis and AMS is so important. I don't have time to go through the whole pathway with you, but it's essentially to say, for many reasons, much of sepsis management has been sort of devolved to ED or ICU, and there really hasn't been a strong focus of the fact that patients come through ED, they go into the hospital, they go up into ICU, and we need to have a cross-hospital approach to how we manage sepsis. Now, I've had plenty of experience already in the precinct with the development of a similar pathway at Peter Mac, which is also very effective in terms of engaging nursing staff for the first time in the initiation of sepsis management and care. And so we used the same principles to develop a clinical pathway which incorporated early identification, empiric management of antibiotics, fluid management, measuring lactate, for example, and blood cultures, as well as providing in the document itself the empiric guidelines for the hospital. I mention that especially because in our feedback around the pathway, it has had a profound influence for our nursing staff who for the first time could understand why an antibiotic was required for a particular condition. What am I supposed to be using for mild pneumonia as opposed to severe pneumonia? And why has this doctor chosen ceftriaxone and azithromycin when they're actually not that severe? And they've been able to start to have those sorts of conversations with the treating teams. And our aims for the program, of course, were to reduce sepsis-related mortality. And for those of you who don't know what that is, many hospital audits have shown that in-hospital mortality of sepsis can reach up to 20%. 20% of met calls usually due to sepsis, and that's a common kind of figure in most hospitals. We also know that if we have early recognition and early resuscitation, we would expect to reduce ICU admission and, of course, consequentially reduce length of stay, and to have this program working across all services. From a stewardship point of view, of course, we want to ensure that patients are getting antimicrobials, antibiotics quickly and appropriately. So I guess I wanted to spend a bit more time talking about what it actually means to do that. It's one thing having a pathway, it's quite a different thing to actually implement it. And what did we need to do such a big program and really get it up and out within a 12-month period? So what did we do first? Well, we employed, fortunately, a very intelligent and efficient American physician assistant, Kelly, who was very comfortable with working across medical and nursing staff. We don't have physician assistants in Australia. It makes me think twice, but she has been an incredible project officer for us, and we had a strong clinical lead from ID, but also from ED and also ICU. We also had a co-lead who was a general physician, David Smallwood. We convened a sepsis working group, and working groups are very important because you need to ensure that the people in your working group are going to be people who are active in the role. And so key members of that working group were the senior medical staff, and particularly the cancer nursing group who had already had the sepsis pathway in their cancer ward for the past 2 years and were very strong advocates because they quickly saw the impact of having a sepsis pathway in their patients on the ward. And so they were very important because they'd experienced it, they knew about it. Then you have to find the right executive sponsor in the hospital, and we had a chief medical officer head of quality, who was our executive sponsor, and then to work out where to report to. And all of you who do AMS, I'm sure, find it hard to work out where you fit inside the hospital governance because we straddle patient safety, we straddle, there's a few smiles in the audience, we straddle infection prevention, we straddle patient safety, we straddle the deteriorating patient. Where does AMS fit? And it's an ongoing issue. And why is it in standard 3, but it also covers medication safety, etc. This is an ongoing issue for AMS, and just like that, sepsis we also need to make sure that it reported to the right groups. So in our hospital, we're representing the AMS committee as well as the deteriorating patient committee, because of course sepsis is part of standard 9 criteria. Then there was a very extensive involvement meeting with heads of departments in every unit in the hospital, including mental health and aged care. and to explain to them the process and engage them. And there was a universal strong response, perhaps a little lukewarm with some of the surgical departments, but it was a very rewarding process. The most important thing, however, is to understand exactly what's happening across your hospital, and that includes what's happening in ED, what your triage criteria, how often do patients get sent off for chest x-rays before they get their cannula antibiotics put in, what's happening up on the wards, what is the level of knowledge gap, how many cannulating nurses do you have up on the ward? If we're going to bring in a sepsis pathway with nurse initiation, are there going to be people to cannulate the patients quickly? These are very basic structural barriers to effective care that you need to systematically go through. Aged care was a great example, very passionate about the program and worked very hard to put structural measures in to make sure that they were able to do it too. That formed the gap analysis, which then really set the series of tasks that we had to do in terms of education and making sure the resources were available. And of course, to modify and adapt the pathway to support all the different types of patients we have in our general hospital. So essentially, it was a whirlwind process. Quite a long time for the consultation and gap analysis, and for those of you considering to do it, it needs to be done carefully and needs to be done with endorsement of the hospital. By the time we got to the pilot, we chose 3 wards. One ward, which was a site of a root cause analysis of a death of a young man who died suddenly of a severe gram-negative sepsis, where there were a number of systematic issues which would, if they had not been there, he probably would have survived. So they were very strong endorsers of wanted to go first. The acute medical unit, which of course there's a big flow on from ED, and they have been fantastic. And then of course ED was a first cab off the rank. It was very important with ED to consider carefully how it would work, because of course many of you are facing the same situation where you have a paperless ED and then a paper inpatient. Some of you obviously have moved to electronic medical systems, but it is important to consider how the ED department deals with a different process from inpatient. And that was an important part of that engagement, to realise that what happens in ED needs to be properly communicated when the patient goes up to the ward, because we know that missed sepsis or cryptic shock that goes up to the ward has a significant mortality rate. And that is actually, if you don't do lactates or measure hyperperfusion and they get to the ward, then they will deteriorate after hours. Moving on from that, it was then a process of training the trainer and really formalising the hospital-wide rollout very quickly, every few weeks. We had checklists in each ward. The NUMs were very engaged. And we developed feedbacks, direct feedbacks to both feedback to nursing staff as well as medical staff who looked after a patient, both in terms of positive feedback. You have managed the patient, you did all the elements correctly, well done, as well as perhaps you need to consider X, Y and Z. And these were used by every unit in their ward audits, nursing handover. And I think the nursing, and particularly the medical staff, found it very useful in the early part of the program, and it was a very important component of the sort of early audit process. So we had a phased rollout, we had executives walking around, we did all the usual things for our launch. It looks a bit like Antimicrobial Awareness Week, doesn't it? And tried to promote it as much as possible. And of course, like everything, to brand the program, we had endorsement from Sepsis Kills in New South Wales to use their logo on the pathway. However, the consumer feedback in our hospital was they didn't like the term kills in something that was supposed to be a good program for patients. And so we developed the Think Sepsis Act Fast, which I think is a very nice way of describing what we need to be thinking about. So we've moved to that rather than the Sepsis Kills for our education and branding of the program. Now, ED were fantastic, and once they came on board, they thought of all sorts of clever ways to improve their pickup of patients. Critically, they included an alert trigger in their Symphony program based on SIRS criteria with a question, could this patient have sepsis? The triage nurse was then to apply a sepsis bomb, which was visible to the clinical staff in ED, and that would trigger the clinical staff to review the patient promptly and to initiate care. This is very important. and that has supported the auditing as well in the ED department. And they also developed their own interest group inside ED with clinicians and nurses to drive the program and the behaviour change. Now, Kelly did a Herculean job of doing sepsis rounds on all the wards each day. We also used our guidance approval system to monitor patients who've been tagged as sepsis, which we have done for some time, but it is a very useful way to look at missed opportunities. It's all very well to have patients on the pathway. You also need to know which patients should have been on the pathway that weren't. And so looking at antibiotics like Pip-Taz, Vanc, Peptrix and Meropenem, and to look to see whether those patients met sepsis criteria, a good trigger to monitor that as well. And I mentioned earlier the feedback templates in terms of meeting the elements of the pathway, absolutely essential. Now, part of the audit was very intensive, of course, so we audited pathways, we audited guidance, and we looked at the outcome measures that were recognised as being very important, both drivers of patient outcome and also cost of care. And I was fortunate to have two suffering medical students that audited hundreds of historical cases and implementation. I felt quite sorry for them really, but anyway, it's very useful data. So just to remind again, normally we have 6 actions, which is oxygen, blood cultures, lactate, rapid fluids, IV antis and monitoring. I put 7 in because I think cannulation, if you can't get a cannula quickly into the patient, that kind of slows everything up. So I kind of call it 7. And the ones I've highlighted in blue are the ones that can be initiated through nursing staff. So it's very important that that initial care can be very much expedited using a nurse-led model. There's some screenshots of the pathway, which asks the medical staff to consider whether it is unknown sepsis or whether it is a focus of infection. And then if it is a focus infection, to consider its severity and then modify the antibiotics accordingly, and to make sure that they think about why and how they're using the antibiotics. Because it is a medical record document, it assists the coders and it also assists the auditing process, and that's been a key element of its importance. And so everyone looks for we have a blue line, Peter Mac has a yellow line, but it's clearly obvious in the patient observation that the patient's on the pathway, and it's been very important communication coming out of ED into the wards. Now, I think it's important to realise that most sepsis comes in through ED, but you can see in the historical cohort there were a few more patients picked up on routine obs in the ward, which may recognise or may indicate patients that have been missed from ED coming into the wards. And the unit review of those patients who are picked up on a routine ward round. And the Met call, of course, which I mentioned before. We also recognise that once you have a strong sepsis pathway in place, it is going to impact on how quickly you get antibiotics. And so you can see historically, CAT 1, 2, 3, 4. CAT 1 is patients need to be seen within 10-15 minutes. CAT 2 within 30, CAT 3 is within 30 minutes. So if you're a CAT 3 patient, which is a green one, you can see it's actually quite hard to sort of be triaged, wait 30 minutes, be seen by medical staff. Historical patients really was taking around about 100 minutes to get antibiotics. You can see once the pathway is implemented, it really came down to the target of 60 minutes. And of course, CAT 1s and 2s, which are very sick patients, were always done quite well because they tend to be managed straight in the resus cubicle. You're probably wondering, well, what happened to antimicrobial use once this pathway went in? And there's always that issue of over-treating sepsis, overuse of antibiotics. What are the unintended consequences of the sepsis pathway? And that is still a valid and important question. And perhaps once we get better data linkages, we can answer a bit more detail. But we did look at what happened with the ED patients in terms of pattern of use, and it was reassuring to see that there was at least some increased use of narrow-spectrum penicillins and no significant changes in Peptrix and Pip-Taz for first dose, and perhaps a little bit more narrow-spectrum empiric. So good signals in our historical and post-implementation cohort to see that there wasn't a sudden shift towards Pip-Taz. The other important intervention that we were able to do because of our sepsis pathway is to implement mandatory approvals, because now that we were comfortable with the fact that all sick patients with sepsis were being managed appropriately, we could enforce the second dose approval. So first dose was permitted and second dose was mandatory. That was launched in September and it's been very successful and has significantly enhanced the ability of our stewardship team to review patients in the subsequent days. Importantly though, we were able to demonstrate significant reduction in mortality, ICU admissions, 3-day length of median length of stay, time to antibiotic therapy, and a hospital where there was 100% utilisation of the pathway. Now, in terms of antimicrobial use, we didn't demonstrate a shoot up in PIP-TAS or MERO, and Keftraxone use has remained stable. Again, this is gross and doesn't talk about appropriateness, but at least it's good signals. We found that the testimonials from both patients and carers really demonstrated that they could understand the benefit of the pathway. And I think that has been sort of the most gratifying thing for me, to hear the feedback from nurses and patients and the medical staff. So my last slide really is, why is it intertwined? Why do AMS need to be working closely with sepsis now? Because it supports a systematic approach. The critical care standard requires that we think about time to antibiotics and severe sepsis. It's because the AMS team are the ones who need to develop the empiric guidelines for the sepsis pathways. And for the first time for me, it's been a real engagement of nursing staff into the holistic care of the patient. And of course, the post-sepsis review process can be incorporated into our antimicrobial stewardship rounds. And I mention again the importance of our team's usually the one that needs to look at the unintended consequences. And I'll leave it at that.